really matters? That might be the most important question you can ask. So let's talk about it. Welcome to What Really Matters podcast, Everyday Spirituality with Karen Wyatt. Thanks for joining me here again today for another episode. And today I want to talk about the idea of humility, which is one of the virtues of life that sometimes I think gets a bad rap, and particularly right now in our society. I think humility might be looked upon as a sign of weakness or softness, having a lack of confidence and a lack of self-esteem. And so I think there is not a lot of value placed on the idea of being humble right now. And yet I believe that it's one of the keys and one of the secrets to actually growing spiritually. So if we think about last week, I talked about loneliness and how loneliness increases when we start on the inward arc. At whatever point in our lives, that transition occurs when we move from the outward arc, focusing on what's around us and what we're achieving and accomplishing in the world outside of us, to suddenly recognizing that the inner realm, the inner aspect of our being is where we really want to dwell and where we need work and where we need to grow. And that is growing ourselves spiritually. And what happens at that inflection point between the outward path and the inward path is that the ego begins to dissolve away, to lose some of its control over our thinking and our behavior. And because humility is actually an anathema to the ego, it makes sense that humility is not valued very much when we're on the outward path, living in the external world. But humility becomes more valuable to us when we begin the inward arc, and as ego begins to lose some of its hold over us, and we begin to seek to grow to become the best people we can possibly be spiritually. And that's when humility shows itself as a valuable partner for us. A quote by Thomas Merton is that pride makes us artificial and humility makes us real. And so pride is part of the false self, the artificial and false self created by the ego, having self-pride. And humility is a virtue of the soul, of the higher consciousness and the true self. So we become more real as we learn to be more humble. And the fact is, because the ego does not like the idea of humility, we may actually need to focus on it a little bit. It may be hard for us to naturally move toward humility without doing a little bit of work and understanding how to be humble and how to get there and what it means. So that's one reason I wanted to talk about it, because I work in the medical profession as a doctor, and throughout all of my training and all of my career, I have recognized that one thing many doctors in particular lack is humility. And I feel it does a great disservice to the practice of medicine, to patients, and even to the well-being of doctors when they cannot be humble about their own knowledge and their experience and their skills. I think it leads to trouble because doctors believe so much that they are right, that what they know is right and correct, that sometimes they fail to listen to the patient. They fail to listen to colleagues or other specialists. They fail to get new information because they're so determined ego-wise to prove that they are right. What they know, how they think, how they see the world is correct and true. And it causes doctors to miss all sorts of important clues and important bits of information that may have helped lead them in a different direction when they're making a diagnosis or determining a treatment. And I've been aware of it, and I've seen it from the very beginning of my medical training. Seeking to be humble is something I've valued. I could recognize early on that it's important to have humility as a medical provider. And because I had really low self-esteem, I thought low self-esteem was the same thing as humility, but it's actually not. In fact, low self-esteem might set a person up to actually have less humility because they're covering up their own insecurity and uncertainty and creating a false bravado. The ego is doing that, inflating this grandiosity in a way of who I am and what I know and how I think. It's all covering up the low self-esteem inside. And so they don't necessarily go hand in hand. Low self-esteem could lead to some humility in a person's behavior. It could also lead to extremely egocentric behavior. And so that varies from individual to individual. And I had to learn that there were definitely ways in which I was not humble at all. And there were certain things that I thought about myself and what I knew and what I understood about life that did not represent humility, even though, again, I had low self-esteem and I was humble in certain ways. In medicine in particular, I did have humility because I never believed that I knew enough. I never believed that I knew everything. I was always aware of how much I was missing, how much more there was that I could have learned or could know. And I always felt insecure somewhat about the amount of knowledge that I had in medicine, which caused me to always try to read more, search for more, ask more questions, look for other answers. But it's more in the arena of spirituality, which is what I'm talking about today, that I had less humility because I was aware from an early age that I had a spiritual wisdom that many of my friends did not have. And so I had to learn over time that humility has to be applied in every aspect of life and every aspect of our being, or else we can't move forward. We can't learn new things if we are not humble enough to admit that we don't know everything. And Paulo Coelho wrote, "We must not confuse humility with false modesty." And I think that's also a good warning. We can put on a type of modesty or pretend that we have humility, and that is sometimes the spiritual ego tries to pretend that it has virtues that it doesn't really have, that it isn't capable of. So again, we have to be able to look within and be a little bit ruthless with ourselves as we examine our own behavior, our motives, look for signs of our ego. How's our ego managing this right now? What's the ego doing? Is it actually slipping in and controlling the situation, or is the ego accepting the idea of being humble? So before we dive further into dealing with how to be humble, I wanted to talk about an article I read from the Greater Good Science Center about humility, where they identified 8 different types of humility, which I'd never thought of before. I always thought of humility as just one thing, but they applied humility in 8 different areas. And I thought we might talk about that a little bit just to help us differentiate and distinguish humility in different areas. And again, for me, because I had some humility around medical knowledge, I may have assumed that meant I'm a humble person in every way. And so that was a fallacy for me that I needed to learn about. And so maybe it's good for us to look at various types of humility that we need to have in our lives. And the first that's mentioned is cultural humility. And I'm very excited because coming up, I have an interview with Dr. Beverly Cursine, who talks about implicit bias in medicine. And one of her points is that we need to have cultural humility rather than cultural competency. And if you listen to End of Life University podcast, you'll hear that interview coming up in a couple of weeks. But cultural humility means that we recognize we have only a partial understanding of people from other cultures than ours, and we cannot make assumptions about anything. And we may have read an article or a book about a different culture, but we cannot assume from that we understand everything about an individual's beliefs simply because they are part of that culture. So we have to always remember to listen and not make assumptions. Next is intergenerational humility within our families. And from the study, they described it as going both ways, that adults need to be humble about the fact that their children are learning things and seeing life from a different perspective from them, and may actually have knowledge and wisdom that the adults have not managed to acquire yet. And children need to learn to respect the adults in their family, the older adults, and recognize that they also have learned from life experience and acquired wisdom that hasn't yet been available to younger people. So going both directions, we need to have intergenerational humility that allows us to listen more and learn from one another. The third type of humility, which I think this among with others applies to medicine, intellectual humility. And in this sense, they're applying it to having an opinion and stating your opinion about things. And they make the quote, "You can be right or you can be happy." And I think they're talking about the fact that sometimes when we hold a very strong opinion, we're not able to be humble about that opinion. We believe it's right, and we go forward as a champion of our own opinion. That can lead us into all kinds of arguments and disagreements with other people who just don't see things the same way. And to have intellectual humility is to be able to back down a little bit and listen and even hold the possibility that this is my opinion because it's based on how I see the world, but another person is seeing the world differently and their opinion may be accurate for them. That is intellectual humility. Not something that exists that often in the medical field, I will say. Next is knowledge humility. Again, this applies to medicine, is believing that because I've studied all these years, I trained all this time, I know so much. I know so much more than the average person. Therefore, I have the ultimate knowledge on this particular subject matter. That is a lack of humility because there's always more to learn. No matter how much we've learned, we cannot possibly know everything. And knowledge humility is to be aware that there may be things out there I have not learned yet. And I'm in the process of learning, so I want to find out about those things. The fifth type of humility is regarding skill. This applies to doctors too. Being aware of the fact that we, no matter how skilled we are at something that we do, we can still make mistakes and we still have limitations. And being able to see the edges in a way of where our skill can take us and where we lack enough skill to continue to move forward. And it's very important to have a humble assessment of how skilled we are when we step out in the world to do our work. But some people rely on the ego's inflation of skill because that's what gives them the confidence to go in the world and offer their tools and their abilities to the world, is believing that they have skill far greater than anyone else. So there's a tricky balance here between having humility and having a realistic assessment of just how good we are at things we do. And no matter how good we are, we can still make mistakes. The sixth type of humility regards wisdom. And so I know it may seem odd to separate out intellectual knowledge, skill, wisdom, but if you think about it, those are actually different things. Knowledge is what we learn from studying and reading and being taught. Skill is something we learn to do. Knowledge is what we contain in our minds and what we can think about and process with, but skill is what we learn to do with our hands. And then wisdom is the learning we gain from life experience. So wisdom kind of transcends the intellect, knowledge, and skill in a sense. And it is this higher awareness of what is good and right and true. And Socrates wrote, "The only true wisdom is knowing you know nothing." So wisdom actually helps us humble ourselves about our knowledge, because wisdom says, nope, you don't know as much as you think you know. And so wisdom, I believe, is what we begin to gain when we're on the inward arc. Some people may think they have more wisdom than they do. I have done that. That's been part of my spiritual lack of humility, is thinking that I had wisdom that I hadn't really learned yet or acquired yet. And I'm able to look back on those times with some laughter now, as as I've gotten older and I've learned more things in life. One study that was cited showed that people who attain a position of power or privilege over other people have a tendency to decline in empathy, relatedness, and wisdom. And that's interesting because being in a position of power really activates the ego. So even a person who may have been trying to get started on their inward arc, dissolving the control of the ego, if that person is put into a position of power where they suddenly have control over other people, they may lose sight of the inward arc and double down on the outward arc and all the trappings of the ego and what it cares about. And their capacity for empathy and relatedness goes down, and suddenly they're not gaining wisdom anymore. They've replaced it with power because the position they're in has given them power. And it's interesting when we think about this. I think about it in terms of medicine and medical colleagues, because they have a great deal of power in situations with patients, but also in our politics, our leaders, the CEOs of corporations who have power. And that suddenly people in that position may lose the good qualities that we observed and that may have gotten them into the positions that they have. They may sometimes become less empathic, less related to others, have less wisdom, because power has inflated the ego and caused the ego to take over their behavior. So it's a really interesting concept, and I was really fascinated to read about that. And that alone was one reason I wanted to separate out these types of humility for us to think about. So that was the sixth type, wisdom, the sixth type of humility. The seventh type of humility is related to awe. And that is the humility that we feel when we're in the presence of something greater than ourselves, something vast. And I've talked about awe a few times before in this podcast. You can go back and listen to that. But when we are in that state of awe, it's as if in the moment we recognize that this universe is vast and incredible. We might be looking up at the Milky Way or the Grand Canyon or a huge building, but as I talked about in another episode, we might just look at a single flower blossom and experience awe. We might watch the raindrops trickling down a window and experience awe in that moment. When we feel awe, we simultaneously are aware of the vastness of the universe, and at the same time, we feel connected to the universe. We know we are part of the universe. We play a role in everything that's happening here, and we may feel very small in terms of our role, but we are essential, and we understand that we are important as part of the universe. So it's this recognition that there's something vast and enormous here, and I'm only a tiny part of it. That's humility. but it's a humility that comes from the strength of knowing I'm a tiny part, but I'm an essential part, and my existence matters, and it's important even in the consideration of this vastness of the universe. And then the eighth type of humility is humility in the face of suffering. And this, I think, is a humility that we learn in our personal lives when we ourselves face suffering and we have to figure out, how do we manage suffering without becoming angry, bitter people? How do we accept the fact that life brings us a certain amount of suffering? How do we live with that? And as we look at the rest of the world, how do we deal with the suffering of other people and seeing it with our own eyes and sometimes being unable to do anything about it? How do we deal with the suffering of the planet, the suffering caused to our nature system by climate change? How do we live with that suffering? And part of our spiritual journey is understanding that life holds suffering along with joy within it. Suffering is a part of life, and it's built into life. It's part of existence and how everything works here in this universe. So we have to be humble enough to accept the suffering that exists here and to figure out how we can live with it. How do we hold it and still focus on having a life of meaning and joy and love, even in the midst of suffering? And that's a huge journey of humility, finding out how to hold both of those in our hands and not get lost in negativity along the way. So those are the 8 types of humility. And I do think it's helpful to break those down because some of us may be fine in certain areas, but learning their different manifestations of humility might help us recognize where we need a little more work. And always, if you feel like you're struggling with humility, understand that's the ego. That's an ego issue. So looking at the ego and holding yourself accountable as far as your ego is one of the ways to address it within. And also know that that could be ego acting up because maybe you're beginning on your inward arc. Maybe you're turning inward and wanting to look at yourself to heal your shadow and heal the past. And sometimes the ego acts up a little bit in those situations and protests, doesn't want to go that direction, doesn't want to move toward humility. And those are great opportunities, those to see ego where it rises up in our lives and to recognize it and to begin to work on it. So there are just a few tips I'm going to give right now for increasing our own humility a little bit and things that we can do. Although the real answer is to go within and look at the ego and address the ego and really journal about the ego. And you can go back and listen to some of my episodes early on in this podcast around ego. Those could be helpful as well. But here are a few things you can do. And then I'll come back next week and focus in on intellectual humility because that is the thing that's lacking in our society right now, and we really need to foster it. And I think we can all tend to fall into a lack of intellectual humility at times when our society has become so polarized, our opinions are so strong, and we feel threatened and become defensive about those opinions. So next week I'll talk more about that, about fostering intellectual humility. But for now, as a takeaway, here's some things to focus on for increasing your ability to be humble in these 8 different ways. First of all, learn how to take a third-person perspective so that anytime you are starting to feel triggered by something or feel defensive, get out of your first person, your own mind, and step back a little bit. And, I would say to myself, I would look at myself and think, oh, Karen is feeling really upset right now. Talking about yourself in the third person, it might sound crazy, like something other people would think is insane. It's a good thing, good way to write in your journal, because you're actually becoming a witness and you're learning how to witness yourself, your behavior, your emotions, and what's going on inside of you. And that's a really key tool to use on the inward arc. So stop and think about things from the third person perspective. It helps calm down the emotions a little bit and can help you get a clearer understanding of what's happening when you do feel triggered. Commit yourself to the idea of being able to disagree with people without being disagreeable in your own behavior. And this takes a ton of work. Just saying, oh, I think I'll do that. That doesn't happen. You have to really commit to it and work on it. But so that's number 2, learn how to disagree with other people without being angry, upset, offensive, insulting in your own behavior. The third tip is to don't take things personally. And this goes back to the 4 agreements that we talked about a few weeks ago. When someone disagrees with your opinion, that's just their opinion. Don't take that personally. Remind yourself not to take it personally, because that's how you get triggered, because it feels like an insult to you that someone disagrees with you. But focus on, wait, whatever that person says, that's about them. That's how they think. That's what they see. That has nothing to do with me. I'm not going to take that in and let it throw me off course. The 4th tip is to be curious, because when people tell you something different than what you know or perceive or believe, the least harmful thing you could do is just ask some questions like, wow, that's interesting. I've never heard that before. Where did you hear that? Where did that come from? Just be curious and ask some questions, and don't be afraid or threatened to do that. Learn how to listen without judging. So you ask the questions and then be willing to listen without jumping right in and interrupting. No, that's wrong. You're wrong about that. Just listen without a judgment and allow the other person to talk and tell you what they believe. Now, your mind is going to be going crazy with all kinds of arguments about what they say, but it's not necessary for you to speak those arguments in the moment. It's more important to listen calmly, and you can retain all of the differences of opinion that you have, but know that there is a right time and a right place to present your differences, and sometimes it's better to listen than to speak your own mind. And then the last tip is to bring in humor. Sometimes when we're having discussions with other people, we get way too serious. And one of the ways of being humble sometimes is to be able to laugh at ourselves. And that's part of witnessing. We can step back and look at ourselves and say, oh my gosh, I made that mistake. Oh, that was silly what I just said. And get comfortable being able to see the humor in how you behave, the humor in your own ego and how your ego thinks and operates sometimes. And see humor sometimes in the mistakes that you make or the limitations that you have. It's okay. It's okay. And it's okay to laugh at that and to be able to laugh at yourself. And that's really kind of the ultimate test of humility. If you can see yourself realistically and not be ashamed or embarrassed, but to find humor in who you are and how you are in the world, along with a commitment like, hey, I'm still growing. I'm going to learn more. I'm going to keep going. So those are my thoughts for today on humility. And as I said, next week I'll come back and we'll focus in on intellectual humility and talk about how to really nourish that and how to develop it in ourselves. So thanks for listening today and joining in with me here on What Really Matters, Everyday Spirituality. And until next week, remember, we're here for love. So face your fear, be ready for what whatever life brings you next, because it will be something unexpected, most likely. And love each and every moment of your very precious life. Bye-bye.